So with that, we will get into my presentation, changing hats. I wear a couple of different hats here. Yeah, I'm just making sure my slides are up there. But today I'm going to be speaking on amplifying impact through collaboration, knowledge mobilization, and data sharing in Arctic research. It's a bridge between the work that I've done with the Arctic Data Committee over the past 2 to 3-ish years and my PhD journey. I am completing, or in my 3rd year PhD with Peter Pulsifer at Carleton University in Canada, where I'm looking to try and bridge existing data systems that we've been working on at the international level down to the global to local levels. And it's a tongue twister. And seeing how we can make those connections, including Indigenous data sovereignty, doing it ethically and equitably. So the exploration of interoperability internationally and knowledge mobilization within a decolonization framework is still a relatively new area of research. Interoperability, we're referring to, again, the degree to which 2 products and programs, technology, computers are talking to each other. And it operates at various levels. So for instance, 2 repositories hosting climate data may describe their data sets using different variables, even if they host data on the same subject but from different years. So without the coordination and collaboration, this disparity hinders the exchange of information, limiting the potential to create more comprehensive and robust data sets. Sorry, I should have done this beforehand, but the acknowledgement country, and I do want to pay respect to the traditional and original owners of this land, the Mwina people, to repay respect to those passed before us and acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal people who are custodians of the land. And so I would like to acknowledge that I'm not an Indigenous person. I come from this very messy space where I have a PhD student hat. I've worked as a data manager for the Polar Data Catalog in Canada, International Technology Office, working on semantics and data interoperability, and then my hat is Arctic Data Committee, and then all of the different working groups that we participate in the polar space, Arctic, Antarctic mixed, but also research data management specifically. It's really difficult to make sure all of these different connections are talking to each other, right? When we have different communities of practice, government levels, Indigenous communities and organizations, and the academic space, and how are we all working towards the same goal, not siloing, reinventing the wheel, all our favorite buzzwords. Yes.
Is it possible to move your little screens?
Like my little box? Good question. Let's see. Working through all the technical difficulties. I'm going to say no. I'm sorry. I guess it was blocked. Okay, well, if you are that interested, I can post some slides, or I can show it to you personally and get really into the nitty-gritty of it. Continuing to polar data principles and what govern our decision-making, or when we're talking about data interoperability and data sharing at the international space and the global or local space. I know everybody in the room here probably has heard about FAIR and CARE, but we're also talking about the trust principles, so the guiding principles that repositories are recommended to adhere to, making sure that your data or the people who are hosting your data or serving your data are transparent about what they're doing with it. They're ensuring responsibility, user focus, and sustainability of technology, so we don't have problems of data just disappearing off the face of the earth. And so the one that actually isn't talked about as much, or it is a little bit in the Indigenous collaboration and community space, is the SHARE principles. And so it's just governance, and ethical considerations when you're working with Indigenous communities. And so as I've been approaching my journey at ADC and as well as my PhD, I've noticed that there's a lot of language surrounding knowledge mobilization when we talk about data sharing and making sure that products that come out of that or data collection are mobilized. And we see that in spaces such as like publications, social media posts, presentations. But what I've noticed is that there's kind of this lack of the extra step down here on the right, which KTA's knowledge to action. And that's what I've really tried to, what I want to be focusing on moving forward. And that's where we're making sure that data is actionable, having that extra step of planning. We're not just storing your data in a repository or making a Facebook post and being like, oh, that's great, everybody's going to really appreciate this information and move forward. It's making sure that any data collected with Indigenous consideration is useful for them, and making sure that it's open. Mobilization as it is more open for interpretation and doesn't necessarily constitute knowledge that supports decision making across the different scales. And so just taking a bigger snapshot of kind of what do I mean when I was saying, well, let's connect all the data systems and see how we can make things better. We have the polar data community in general is a messy space. And so we had my lens and the snapshot of all the different hats that I wear and, you know, spaces that we work in, but it's also when we're looking about where is polar data, it's not as straightforward as I'm sure we all know in the room, but we still like our spaghetti diagram for mapping the polar data ecosystem. This is actually still open to update too. So if anybody wants to make sure their repository or their data sources are incorporated in this, please reach out to Peter or myself and we can get you connected. But mapping the polar data ecosystem is showing where data is hosted and the different sharing relationships within these organizations. So like having data one is that data that's hosted there being harvested in something like the Polar Data Search, where Polar Data Search is an aggregation of metadata records where you can find about 30, I think we're up to 31 repositories at this point in one space. So instead of hitting all of those little dots of the different data sources, how can we streamline this, make data more accessible, the findability and the accessible of our FAIR principles better? So yes, taking a kind of a quick snapshot of our global perspectives, a national use case, and then our local, and getting into more of that interoperability piece and where Indigenous data sovereignty and the whole point of the session comes into it. So as I mentioned, Polar Data Search, it's a metadata search, and it's using a lightweight vocabulary called schema.org. It's placed on top of existing metadata standards, and as many of you worked in this, and it's a little repetitive for you, but it's just trying to work through a decentralized data sharing space instead of forcing everybody to go off of one metadata standard. As we know, that was impossible. So Polar Data Search is supposed to be this lightweight alternative that, again, streamlines the findability of data, metadata specifically, but it does leave the decision-making and licensing that is already applied at the repository level, and that decision-making process remains with the original repository. We're not changing anything like that. It displays, you know, if the data is open or whatnot, but it does bring you back to the original source. A national initiative that I wanted to highlight is kind of a metadata mediator from the Canadian Polar Data Consortium, formerly Canadian Consortium for Arctic Data Interoperability, or CPDC, where they did this at the national level. So it's about, I think there's 7 or 8 repositories that CPDC has worked with across Canada, and they created this mediation tool to do that automatic crosswalking of the metadata standards, because even in Canada, we're not working off of one standard. And it does the automatic mediation using, you know, ISO schema.org that feeds further into the Polar Data Search. So there's a really good connection with this use case and connecting up to the global scale. But then, and sorry, this is the example of the metadata API that gets pulled and served into the Polar Data Search. But looking at the local level or regional level, how do we connect data that's collected there, or community-based monitoring programs? So narrowing down the scope to the regional level and working with specifically the GCRC, which is the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center that I'm at with Peter. And we were invited by SmartICE, which is a community-based monitoring program in Canada and across the Canadian Arctic. And so we're looking at working with them as use case to see how we can really leverage their data holdings for the communities. They have created CICE terminology books with the different dialects of Inuktitut across the Canadian Arctic. And so how would we incorporate their CICE terminology and their language into our existing data systems to get the information that they would want out of it? They also do smart buoys monitoring for CICE and smart comatic as well. So, you know, how are they using this data? Is it usable for them? And from experience right now it's producing graphs. Is that really the most effective way to communicate or to support their decision-making pathways in their community? So you can see that SmartICE and all the little black dots around, you can see that, yeah, I'm not blocking it. You can see that the SmartICE works with 30-ish communities, and how do you mobilize that data of the 30 communities to support the rights holders and communities together? And so that's a complicated topic, and it's, getting into the technical space, but I was kind of trying to be like, that really is bridging our Western research data management frameworks with Indigenous data sovereignty frameworks. And it's just the diagram is a small example of all little considerations that would happen at the different stages of the research process. So, during storage, who actually has the control and ownership in physical and digital copies, and the use of data, making sure it's actionable, that we've already discussed. And through that, I adapted an existing principle. So utilizing and really focusing on co-production of knowledge methodologies, data methods, and creating a cohesive framework that accounts for Indigenous data sovereignty and governance, as well as research data management and co-production. So this is done in partnership, again, with SmartICE, but also incorporating the international data community initiatives that are already existive and very well along. So you can see one of the problems that I kind of noticed when, we talk about care principles is, well, how do you actually implement it, right? Like, it's a lot of governance frameworks, but what's the nitty-gritty decision-making things that you need to communicate with a community-based monitoring program to help enable and operationalized care in the first place and get them brought up to speed with something like the FAIR principles and data sharing at the global level and all the initiatives that we have our hands into. So you can see at the outer ring of this diagram, we have those kind of more data sovereignty principles, or the actionable items. We have standards, semantics, technology, the tools. What are those? But then keeping the core of co-production and our ethical and equitable responsibility to the engagement process at our core. And just highlighting that this does change depending on who the actors you're working with. So this is just a total hypothetical at this point, so please don't hold me to it. But having something like SmartICE, who is a community-based monitoring program, might have different priorities highlighted in the red compared to maybe an international organization like the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So again, how are we incorporating Indigenous data sovereignty decision-making and actual actionable sovereignty decisions for both of those scales? And so green is kind of like, oh, maybe they would have some interest, but something like ICC, they're not necessarily like holding data. They're more interested in maybe sharing or utilizing what's already out there. Where you have SmartICE, they're kind of like, well, we're producing our data. We were going to make sure it's actionable for us. Maybe we aren't as concerned about the specific semantics as long as it aligns with our things and doesn't need to really connect with that international space. And as we know, things are a little bit more complicated. I like my simple diagrams, but the relationships between these different, the sovereignty considerations as well as our co-production is a lot messier. So I know this one's a little harder to see, but the point is just the interrelationships of these different concepts or the different conceptual things that we need to consider is a lot more interconnected. And again, just trying to break it down that at each planning stage of the research life cycle, that there's different Indigenous data sovereignty pieces that we need to be considering, including standards, vocabularies, processing tools, and how do you make that interoperable in the future. So currently we are in partnership with, or in talks with, working with Arctic Bay in Nunavut, and hoping to work with them to get a framework established and have actually like a proof of concept developed, where you would make sure that the data that is produced in Arctic Bay with their smart comatics, their smart buoys, and their sea ice terminology connecting to the international space, such as Polar Data Catalog or Polar Data Search, or things like Arctic Passion, where they have smart buoys out in the Baffin Bay area already, and is that data going to be useful for Arctic Bay's needs? We don't really know that. It's something that we're going to explore as long as that's what the community wants, and we're in the consultation phase. So maybe in 2 years' time, this will be completely different, but this is where we think we're heading at this time. And just trying to aim for actionable data for Northern decision makers, connecting the knowledge systems of Western and Inuit, trying to create a replicable framework. So as right now, using the sea ice use case, we're hoping that it can be applied in different domains. But ensuring, again, co-production design. And one of the challenges that I've been experiencing thus far is just increased data literacy with the community themselves. So when we're trying to make these decisions, say, hey, you have the right to share your data or keep it restricted, and all these super fun data sovereignty considerations, what standard do you want to use? It's hard to have those conversations when they're sitting there like, what's metadata? Right? And so increasing and educating existing initiatives out there and having those conversations at the community level, I think is still very important, but it's coming as a challenge. And so hopefully we'll help share some lessons learned after the project's done. But with that, thank you for listening, and I appreciate it, and come let me know if you have any questions. Okay, so I know we do have, since Claire did drop out, is there any questions that anybody has right now? Or if not, we can move to data storytelling. Yes, Taro.
Well, thank you.
Oh, sorry, Taro. I've got yelled at before.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you for interesting presentation. The question and reflection that I have is that this is, of course, building on the Canadian context, and we didn't, or I didn't hear much about, for example, the European Arctic, where we don't have a lot of commissions like that, or land claims, for example, that would lead to a case like in Nunavut. But the question is that what are the assumptions for use of data? Because even if you have these great principles like care and fair and so on, one of the critical views that's come up, for example, in the Arctic Passion and so on, is that what are we advancing? Are we advancing, for example, the interest of mining companies or geopolitics, when there's somehow assumption that data should be shared? And I would encourage you to perhaps have a reflection on that we shouldn't assume anything. We should also be having some option for the folks to say no, or have a more varied context, in the sense that we know even from Canada that there are some operators like mining companies that have hired elders to go and travel to identify rare earth mineral spots or other viable ore areas, and that's a use of data that advances a single interest, as opposed to what I heard here, which is more like a general interest on how do we know about the Arctic or its changes or polar regions. And the very quick one sentence reflection, now that we are all getting old, us veterans of the Arctic collaborations, that I'm reminded by the Iqaluit Oral History Project that started in 1986 in Nunavut and in Iqaluit. And they had a mechanism where the Inuit elders were asking that any researcher that comes in leaves a copy of, for example, an oral history interview or some of the things back with the community, so that there was a link between avoiding the parachute research, and often they would also have in the community radio the researcher come in and explain about the wonderful world of mollusks or whatever they were studying, walrus, so that there was exactly what you said, this understanding of who comes and what is the purpose of the research. So I would encourage you also to, given that of course Nunavut is centrally placed in your work, look perhaps into the Iqaluit experience, because 40 years ago they started to have a mechanism on that. So yeah, but just so in summary, a quick question on interest. Whose interest are we advancing, and can you say no? And secondly, this you don't have to comment, but the Iqaluit 1986 oral history work. Yeah.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, and that is a really important part, and part of the conversations that we're having, going to be having with Arctic Bay literally next week. I'm going from here to there. We'll be making or having those conversations that they can say no. It's as open as possible, as close as necessary, right? So how would we incorporate those stopgaps, set that maybe if they do want to share with only other Inuit communities to ensure that they, they're not exposing sensitive data to dual purpose things that come down or whatnot. How do you implement that in a technical way within this framework? And there's not a clear, or not that we have learned thus far, there's not a clear pathway for that. And just communicating that, yes, they can say no. And I don't think that's talked about enough. So appreciate your comment, and I will look into the Igloolik example because that's not something that I've been familiar with yet. But I will also add that's part of the purpose of trying to make data more actionable or useful, because it's great if a researcher comes into a community, transcribes everything, say on a piece of paper and drops it and say, oh, I handed it back to them, but is that really useful for them? And so part of the framework is taking those things into consideration and trying to make things actually useful, so it's not just extractivism and me being like, oh, fix your problems and moving on. And hopefully we can explore that further moving forward. But good points. Thank you, Taro. Yep. Mark, sorry. Slide.
The comment to follow up on that, because you raised a really good point, Taro.
The comment, yep, there we go. To follow up on what Taro was saying, is I think it's a really good point. And it gets to your point about the difficulty of implementation of the care principles, because part of this is the authority to control, that's the ability to say no. But I think the key thing here is the collective benefit. And really, who is the collective that we're talking about here? I think that needs to be kind of defined up front. The collective can include the squirrel, like in Taro's case. Yeah. And if it does include the mining company, that needs to be very explicit up front. So understanding who that collective is in the collective benefit is, I think, an important piece of this.
Thank you. Yeah, and even just highlighting that like technology itself is considered an actor in this exercise, right? So yeah, how do you utilize that, but make sure you're incorporating those technical considerations. So thank you. Any other questions? Anybody online? No? Amazing. Well, thank you so much for listening to me. You represent this section, and I would like to invite Shannon McAllister up so she can lead us into the data storytelling session. Thank you.